My mother called me 3 times in 4 minutes, and I knew before I picked up that my brother had done something. She never calls 3 times, unless it is about Ryan. I am Mara Jennings, by the way 31, contracts lawyer, the daughter my family has always described as the capable one, which I have learned over the years is just a polite way of saying the one we do not worry about, which is just a polite way of saying the one we do not invest in. I was at my desk, reviewing a contract that needed to go out before 5, when her name appeared on my phone, the 3rd time. I picked up, because 3 calls in 4 minutes from your mother means you pick up. She said, Mara, we need to talk about Ryan. I put my pen down. Those 6 words. We need to talk about Ryan. I had heard some version of them my entire life. They had preceded conversations about his failing grades, his first car accident, the 3 weeks he disappeared at 22, and came back quieter and thinner, and my parents never fully explained where he had been. They had preceded every financial emergency, every lost job, every relationship that ended badly, and became somehow everyone else's problem to manage. We need to talk about Ryan had never once in my life preceded anything good. I said what happened. She said he is in some financial trouble, significant trouble. And your father and I have been talking, and we think the fairest thing, the right thing for the whole family, is for you to help him get through this. I said how much. She said $60,000. The office went very quiet around me. I said 60,000. She said it accumulated over time. You know how these things. I said whose name is the debt in. Pause. Long enough to tell me the answer was complicated. She said mostly his. But there are some aspects that are a little more. I said, Mom, I will call you tonight. I have to finish something. I hung up. I sat at my desk, and I stared at the contract on my screen, and I did not read a single word of it for 6 minutes, because I was doing something else entirely. I was deciding who I was going to be from this moment forward. Please subscribe and hit the like button if you are new here. And stay, please stay until the very end, because the decision I made after that phone call is not the one you are expecting right now. I promise you that. Stay with me. Every single part of this story matters. Let me tell you about my brother, not to make him the villain of this story. I am genuinely trying not to do that, because the truth is more complicated than a villain, and the complicated version is the only honest one. Ryan is 28 years old, 3 years younger than me. And from the moment he arrived in our family, he occupied a specific space that I spent years trying to understand, and eventually named with a word that is not kind, but is accurate. He was the one they poured everything into. Not because he was more loved. I do not believe that. I believe my parents loved both of us, genuinely and completely, in the way that parents love their children, without condition, without reservation, with a specific totality that makes parental love unlike anything else. But love and investment are different things. And every dollar of investment in our house, every ounce of focused energy, every late-night conversation, every resource made available, every problem treated as a family emergency rather than an individual one, went to Ryan, because Ryan needed it. That was the logic. And here is the thing about that logic that took me until I was approximately 25 years old to fully understand. Ryan needed more, because Ryan was given more. And the more he was given, the more he needed, because nobody ever required him to develop the capacity to need less. It is not a character flaw, exactly. It is what happens when a person grows up, never being asked to figure things out alone. I grew up being asked to figure things out alone, constantly. Not because my parents were cruel, but because I did it well, and Ryan did not, and so resources followed the difficulty, and I, being consistently capable, consistently received less of them. Ryan failed 2 classes in 9th grade. My parents hired a tutor and drove him twice a week for a full year, and sat with him through homework every night for a semester. When I struggled with advanced math the same year and asked my father to explain something, he said, "You always figure it out, Mara. Just work through it." I worked through it, Ryan crashed his car at 19. My parents paid the gap on his insurance, covered the damage to the other vehicle, spent weeks in crisis mode around him, checking in daily, losing sleep, treating it like a family emergency that required everyone's attention. When I had a minor fender bender at 21, my father said, "As long as you are okay, sort it out, and let me know if you need anything." I sorted it out. I did not call back to let him know I needed anything, because I already knew what the answer would feel like. Ryan lost his first real job at 24. My parents paid his rent for 8 months. Not a loan, a gift. Freely given, because he was struggling, and they could not watch him struggle without intervening. I have never received a single financial contribution from my parents toward anything. Not my education, not my apartment, not my car, not a single emergency in 10 years of adult life. I am not saying this to perform resentment. I made peace with it a long time ago, or I thought I had, because I had built a life that was entirely mine, and there was a satisfaction in that, even when it was hard. The satisfaction was real. The exhaustion underneath it was also real. And then my mother called 3 times in 4 minutes and said $60,000, and the exhaustion stopped being underneath anything and came fully to the surface for the first time. Because here is what $60,000 meant in the specific context of my family. It meant that Ryan had accumulated $60,000 of debt over an unspecified period of time through a combination of poor financial decisions and possibly something more deliberate that my mother had hinted at with the words, "some." Aspects that are a little more complicated, a phrase she had used and then retreated from so quickly that I had filed it immediately in the section of my brain that stores things to examine more closely later. It meant that my parents, who had spent 28 years solving Ryan's problems for him, had reached the end of their own ability to solve this one. And it meant that they had looked at their 2 children and made a calculation. Ryan cannot fix this. Mara can. Therefore, Mara should. That calculation. Right there. That is the thing I kept coming back to, sitting at my desk for 6 minutes, not reading the contract in front of me. Not whether I had the money. I had savings. 6 years of building a career and living carefully had produced savings that were real and meaningful and that I had specific plans for. Not whether I loved my brother. I did. Complicated love that had been tested many times, but that was still love. The thing I kept coming back to was the calculation itself. Mara can. Therefore, Mara should. I had been living inside that calculation my entire life without ever naming it directly. I was naming it now. And naming it changed something that had been sitting very still inside me for a very long time. I called my mother back that evening at 7:30. I was home by then, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I had not touched, and my laptop open to nothing in particular. She answered immediately. She said, "I am so glad you called back. Your father and I have been so worried." I said, "Tell me everything, all of it, not the version that makes it easier to ask me. The full version." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mara." I said, "Mum, all of it, please." She told me in the specific way my mother tells difficult things. Slowly, with long pauses, with the careful architecture of someone who is giving you information in an order designed to make each piece land as softly as possible before the next one arrives. It started 2 years ago. Ryan had gotten involved in a business with a friend whose name my mother mentioned once, and then did not mention again, in a way that told me the friend was more central to this story than she wanted to get into. The business had required investment. Ryan had put in money he did not entirely have, and borrowed the rest. The business had failed. The debt from the business loan was $38,000. Then there were credit cards, used during the period after the business failed, when Ryan did not have income and needed to cover his living expenses, and my mother's words here, delivered in the specific, careful tone of a woman walking across ice, made some decisions that, in retrospect, were not the best ones. The credit card debt was $14,000. That was $52,000. I said you said 60. My mother paused. She said there is one more thing. I waited. She said some of the business paperwork. Ryan had asked you. Do you remember a couple of years ago when he asked you to look at some documents? I went completely still. I did remember. 2 years ago, Ryan had called me and asked if I could look over some business documents as a favour, as his lawyer sister, just to check them over. I had looked at them on a Sunday afternoon, and I had signed off on one of them, a relatively minor-seeming document that I had reviewed quickly because I trusted him, and because it had seemed straightforward, and because I was his. Sister and he had asked me as a favour. I said, Mum, what did I sign? She said there is a personal guarantee attached to part of the business loan, with your name on it. $8,000. $8,000. My name. A document I'd signed as a favour to my brother 2 years ago had made me personally liable for $8,000 of his business debt, without my full understanding of what I was signing. I was a contracts lawyer. I had signed a document I had not read carefully enough because I trusted my brother. The irony of that sat in my chest, like something with weight. I said, does Ryan know that I am on the guarantee? My mother said yes. I said, did he know when he asked me to sign it? The longest pause of the entire conversation. She said, Mara. He was in a difficult position. He needed the loan, and the lender required a guarantor, and he did not want to worry you with all the details he just. I said, Mum, did he know? She said yes. He knew. I put the phone down on the table. Not hanging up, just putting it down and looking at my kitchen wall for a moment. He had known. He had called me as his sister, asking a favour, and he had handed me a document that made me financially liable for his debt, and he had known exactly what he was handing me, and he had not told me. And my parents had known this for some period of time. I did not yet know how long, and the call they had made to me was not actually a request for help. It was a notification that I was already involved. The decision about whether to help had already been made on my behalf 2 years ago by my brother, who had handed me a pen and called it a favour. I picked the phone back up. I said, how long have you and Dad known about the guarantee? She said we found out a few months ago. I said, and you waited until the debt was being called to tell me. She said we were trying to find another way first. We did not want to put this on you if we could avoid it. I said, but you could not avoid it. She said the lender is moving forward. The guarantee means you are legally obligated for the $8,000 regardless. The rest, the $52,000. That is what we are asking if you can help with. As a family. Because he is your brother, and because your father and I cannot cover it ourselves, and because you are in a position where... I said where I can, so I should. She said we knew you would understand. I said I will think about it. I will call you by the weekend. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time. Not angry. Not yet. Something colder than anger. The specific cold clarity of a person who has just seen a picture they have been looking at their entire life suddenly come into focus in a way they cannot unsee. I was a contracts lawyer, and I had just had the most important contract of my life explained to me. The unwritten one. The one that said Mara is capable, therefore Mara is responsible. For herself, for her brother, for whatever gap exists between what Ryan needs and what our parents can provide. I had been living under that contract since I was approximately 8 years old, and nobody had ever asked me to sign it. I spent 3 days thinking before I called anyone. Not my mother, not my father, not Ryan. I called my best friend Dee on the first evening because Dee was the person I called when I needed to say things out loud before I was ready to decide what to do with them. She answered at 9:30 and I talked for 20 minutes without stopping. When I finished, she said, "Okay, what do you actually want to do? Not what you think you should do. What do you want?" I said I want to not pay $60,000 of debt that my brother accumulated and then put my name on a guarantee without fully explaining what he was doing. She said, "Okay. And what else?" I said I want my family to understand something they have never understood about me. That I am not a resource. That I am a person. That capable does not mean available. That the fact that I can do something does not obligate me to do it. Dee was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So, what are you going to do?" I said I am going to handle the 8,000. Because I am legally obligated, and because I am not going to damage my professional reputation over something I can cover, even if covering it is deeply unfair. She said, "And the rest?" I said the rest I am going to let my family figure out. Dee said your mother is not going to like that. I said I know. She said your brother is going to say you abandoned him. I said I know that too. She said, "And your father?" I said my father is going to stay quiet, because he always stays quiet when things get difficult between me and my mother, and I have made peace with that. Dee said, "So you are really doing this?" I said, "I am really doing this, but I am not just saying no. I have thought about this for 2 days, and there is more to it than no." She said, "Tell me," and I did. Because the decision was not just about the money. It never had been. The decision was about the contract, the unwritten one, the one that had governed my family for 23 years, and that I had never directly addressed, because addressing it had always felt like an act of aggression against people I loved. I was done being afraid of that. I was going to address it. Directly, clearly, in a way that could not be softened, or reframed, or tucked back into the family mythology, about who Mara was, and what Mara was for. I called my mother on Saturday morning. I asked her to have my father there, as well. I asked her to have Ryan there too. She said, "Is that necessary?" I said yes. They were all at my parents' kitchen table when I arrived at 11. Ryan looked at the table when I walked in. Not at me. At the table. I noticed that. I sat down. I said I want to talk about some things, and I need everyone to let me get through all of it before anyone responds. Can you do that? My mother looked at my father. My father looked at his hands. Ryan looked at the table. I said I am going to take care of the $8,000 guarantee. I have spoken to a lawyer, not myself, because you should never represent yourself in your own financial matters, which is something I would have told Ryan if he had actually explained what he was asking me to sign 2 years ago, and I am going to handle it properly and cleanly, and it will be done within the month. Nobody spoke. I said, I am not going to contribute to the remaining $52,000. My mother started to say something. I said I am not finished. She closed her mouth. I said I want to tell you why. Not because I need your permission or your agreement, but because I think you deserve the honest reason, rather than just the answer. I looked at Ryan. He was still looking at the table. I said, "Ryan, I need you to look at me." He looked up. I said you handed me a document 2 years ago, and you did not tell me what it was. You needed a guarantor, and instead of explaining what you needed, and asking me properly, you gave me something to sign, and called it a favor. You used the fact that I trusted you to make a financial decision about my life without my informed consent, and you have never once mentioned it, or apologized for it, or acknowledged that what you did was a significant thing. He said, "Mara, I was in a really..." I said, "I know you were in a difficult position. I understand that. But the difficult position you were in was the result of decisions you made, and the solution you chose involved using me without my full knowledge. I need you to understand that I know that. That I have always known something was off about that document, and that I am done pretending I was not smart enough to eventually figure it out." He looked at the table again. I said, "Mom, Dad." My parents looked at me. I said, "I love you both. I genuinely do. And I am not saying what I am about to say to hurt you. I am saying it because I have been carrying it for a long time, and I think the only way to put it down is to say it out loud in a room where everyone can hear it." My mother's hands were folded on the table. I said, "I have never once been the priority in this family. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that anyone intended. But every resource, financial, emotional, time, attention, has flowed toward Ryan for as long as I can remember. And the reason it was able to flow that way for so long is because I never required it. Because I figured things out. Because I was capable. And capable meant I did not need what Ryan needed. And so capable became the reason I received nothing. My father looked at the window. My mother's eyes were wet. I said, I am not asking you to agree with me. I am not asking you to apologize. I am asking you to understand one thing. Capable is not the same as available. The fact that I can do something financially, professionally, practically, does not mean I am obligated to do it, just because Ryan cannot. I am not a backup resource for this family. I am a person, and the decision about what I do with my money and my life belongs to me. The kitchen was very quiet. Ryan said, so, you were just going to let me drown. I looked at him. I said, Ryan, I am going to say something, and I need you to really hear it. He waited. I said, I am not letting you drown. I am not throwing you a rope either. What I am doing is standing on the shore and watching you figure out how to swim. Because you are 28 years old, and every time you have been in water, someone has jumped in after you, and you have never learned to swim because you have never needed to. I love you. And I am not going to be the next person who jumps in. Not because I do not care. Because I do. He did not say anything. My mother, said Mara. $60,000. He cannot manage that alone. I said I know. He is going to have to find a way to manage it anyway. I stood up. I said I am not disappearing from this family. I am not punishing anyone. I am coming to Christmas, and I am calling on birthdays, and I am here for the real things, the emergencies that are actually emergencies, the grief, the illness, the things that are beyond anyone's control. But this is not that. This is a debt my brother created and partially placed on me without my knowledge, and it is not mine to carry beyond the legal obligation I already have. I picked up my bag. I said I love all of you. I walked out. That was 7 months ago. I want to tell you where things are, because I think you deserve the honest version, and not the version where everything resolves cleanly, because real things do not resolve cleanly. The $8,000 is handled. I worked with my lawyer, someone I trusted, specifically because she was not me, and we addressed the guarantee properly and cleanly, and it is done. It cost me $8,000 and approximately 3 weeks of elevated stress. And I will not pretend that sitting across from a bank representative and paying money I should not have owed did not make something inside me tighten in a present rand way that took days to release. But it is done. Ryan is managing the rest of the debt himself. I know this because my mother tells me. Not with approval, with a kind of surprised, reluctant reporting that tells me she had genuinely not believed he was capable of it. He has a payment plan in place. He has picked up additional work. He has not asked me for anything since the kitchen conversation 7 months ago. I do not know if that silence is pride or resentment or genuine respect for what I said. Maybe it is all three. Maybe it changes, depending on the day. My relationship with my mother has been the most complicated thing to navigate. She called me the week after the kitchen conversation, and she was careful. Not cold, careful. The way people are careful when they are not sure what ground is solid anymore. We talked for 40 minutes about things that were not the debt and not the conversation, and at the end she said, I hear what you said last week. I have been thinking about it. I said okay. She said, I do not think your father and I realized how it looked from where you were standing. We were always so focused on... She stopped. I said, I know, Mum. She said, I am not sure I handled things fairly with you over the years. That sentence, that specific sentence from my mother sitting somewhere 4 miles away on the phone. I had not expected it. I said, I appreciate you saying that. She said, I mean it. I said, I know you do. We did not hug it out in a movie way. We did not have a breakthrough that solved 23 years in one afternoon. But something shifted. Something that had been fixed in a position it had occupied my whole life moved slightly toward where it should have been. That is not nothing. That is actually quite a lot. My father called me 2 weeks later. He is not a man who calls to talk about feelings. He is a man who calls to check in on practical things. and communicates everything else through the practical things he chooses to check in on. He called and asked about my car service and my work schedule and whether I had seen the news about the thing he knew I would have an opinion on. And at the end, he said you did the right thing, 7 months ago, at the kitchen table. I said, thanks, Dad. He said, you have always done the right thing. We should have said that more. I said, yeah. He said, we should have said a lot of things more. Then he talked about the news thing for 10 more minutes, because that is who he is, and I love him for it. Ryan and I have not had a direct conversation since the kitchen. Not because I closed that door. I have not closed it. But I have not opened it either, because I think the opening when it happens, if it happens, needs to come from him. Needs to be his choice, and his timing, and his words, and not something I engineer, because I am uncomfortable with the silence and want to smooth it over. I have spent my whole life smoothing things over. I am trying to let things be unsmooth for as long as they need to be. Dee asked me last month, do you regret it? I thought about it properly before answering because it deserved a proper answer. I said I regret that it took me 31 years to say it out loud. I do not regret saying it. She said, do you think it changed anything? I said I think it changed me. Whether it changed them is something I do not have control over, and I am learning to be okay with that. She said, you seem different. I said I feel different. She said lighter. I said, not lighter, exactly. More like the right weight. Like I was carrying extra for a long time, and now I am just carrying my own. That is the best way I have found to describe it. My own weight. After 31 years of carrying extra without being asked, and without being thanked, and without being seen clearly enough for anyone to understand what it was costing me, I am carrying my own now. And it turns out my own is something I can manage just fine. I always could. I just never got to find out until now. If you made it to the very end of Mara's story, thank you. This one was not about money, really. It was about a woman who spent her whole life being the capable one, and finally deciding that capable did not mean available. If any part of this hit you, the unwritten contract, the kitchen table conversation, what her father said on the phone, or that last line about carrying your own weight, drop it in the comments. Tell me which moment got you. I read every single one. If Mara's story moved, you share it right now. Send it to the woman in your life who has always been the one who figures it out. The one who is so capable that nobody asks if she is okay. The one who has been carrying extra for so long, she has forgotten what her own weight feels like. She needs to hear this story. Like this video if you stayed until the very last word. Subscribe, because my next story is going to stop you completely. I will see you then.